processed.
Thank you. Thank you.
You are now recording.
Okay, it is 1 p.m. on January 20th, 2026. This is a meeting of the Land Use Review Board. I am Janet Curley, the chair. I will ask others to introduce themselves. Sarah.
Sarah Hyde, good afternoon.
Kirsten.
Kirsten Sultan, present.
Alex.
Alex Weinhagen. Hello, everyone.
And Brooke.
Brooke Dingledine, good afternoon.
Thank you. Any agenda updates from board members? I'm seeing shaking heads and otherwise nobody's raising their voices or hands. So, for public comment on non-agenda items, I don't see any public that might be here for non-agenda item. From the Lamoille County Planning Commission just joined us, as we have received a pre-application from Lamoille County Planning Commission, and that shortly. Let's move on to item D, consent agenda. So we are looking at minutes from, oh shoot, I'm in the wrong screen here. Hold on. Minutes from January 5th and January 12th. And I had noted one phrase in the budgeting reporting, and our business manager suggested some revised language, and I believe that was shared with board members. Oh, sorry, Sarah, go ahead.
I was just going to make a motion to approve the January 5th and January 12th minutes as with the proposed amendments.
Okay, thanks.
I'll second.
Thank you, Kirsten. Sorry, I jumped the gun on discussion, so let's continue discussion of those two sets of minutes. Rachel suggested some revision to the phrase about the budget. And then I had suggested a revision to the July 12th minutes in terms of removing the names of those who were present only for the executive session from the list of attendees. Any discussion of those proposed revisions? Okay.
Your revisions look good to me, Janet.
Okay. Ready to vote? All right, let's vote. All those in favor of approving both of those sets of minutes, please say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Sarah, I didn't catch your vote.
Aye.
Okay, that's unanimous. Next item, Lamoille County Regional Planning Commission pre-application board designee assignment pursuant to the Regional Planning Commission application guidelines. I need to preface this conversation. Who is here from Lamoille?
We have Tasha Wallace, Executive Director, and Megan Rodier, Regional Planner.
Thank you, Tasha and Megan. We have a little bit of some missing data on the for the map viewer. We didn't receive anything for Tier 1B in terms of GIS data, so we still need that. And I had talked with Seth on Friday.
We did send the Tier 1B data with the preliminary submission. And I think Alec probably resent it to Josh on Friday.
Okay, Josh just indicated to me today that he did not have that.
Okay, we'll get it to you. Yep.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then one last thing is we were hoping to get your flood hazard planning layer. also.
Okay.
And I did talk with Alec about getting that on Friday, so maybe he just hasn't gotten to it yet. And so we can discuss this offline, but we need that before we can make a determination of completeness.
Okay.
We're conferring with
We will.
Alec at the moment.
Okay, great. Thanks, Seth. Is that Seth? Sounds like
That's
Seth.
it.
That's Seth.
Hold
I
on,
just
no.
joined.
Alec is here. He wanted to share his conversation with Josh.
Yeah, can Alec share with
Yep.
you real quick? Just bring you up to
Sure.
speed.
So on Friday afternoon, I sat down with Josh and we went through the data standard for the FLU layers. I had asked about the Tier 1B and the flood overlay, to which Josh said there was no standard for at this point and to wait for guidance.
Okay. Maybe after this meeting, Alec, we can get together and resolve this.
Okay.
In the interim, the board does need to assign a designee who will coordinate your pre-application review. So can you turn your sound off at LCPC? There's a lot of background noise. Thank you. Okay, so board members, we need to assign a designee to conduct the pre-application review. We almost have a complete application. We just have this little Tier 1B data hole. Do you all feel ready to make a designation on this pre-application? I see some nods. I would like to put forth Brooke as the designee. And can I have somebody maybe make that motion?
Can you confirm that you're comfortable doing it?
That I'm
Brooke
comfortable
is
doing it.
gung-ho.
I'm next step back, so I'm ready to jump in.
I'll make a motion that Brooke be the designated board member to help shepherd the Lamoille County Regional Plan pre-application.
Thank you, Alex.
I'll second.
Thank you, Kirsten. Any discussion? Okay, let's vote. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
And that is 5. So Brooke, you are the designee for Lamoille County Regional Planning Commission pre-application. Thank you for stepping up. I'll be
I get-
there with you every step of the way that you need me.
I get extra credit per page.
Can we just quickly address the timing of the site visit and the eventual public meeting on this particular one? Or do you want to talk about planning for this in general later in our agenda?
We could briefly, Alex, what are your thoughts?
My thought is that in the first 3 plans that we did, it was awkward to have the site visit on the same day as the deadline for comments or very close to it. Like
Yeah.
I felt like a fair number of people, including myself as a board member, were sort of looking to the site visit and the public meeting as a way to get more information in order to finalize comments. So
Yeah.
if there's any way with Lamoille that we can schedule the site visit and the public meeting with like at least a week
Yeah.
or 2
Yeah. Yeah.
before the deadline for comments, I would prefer that.
Yeah, so that would be sort of early in February if we were to finalize the application today or determine it complete today. So, yeah, does that sound okay to Lamoille County Planning Commission? that we try to schedule a meeting early in Lamoille County?
Sure,
Yes,
yeah, come on down. It's snowy here. I see a lot of snowy backgrounds.
Okay, that'd be great. Okay, so Brooke, you will try to make that happen for us?
Certainly will. See
Okay,
what works
And-
best.
And
Okay,
Janet,
great.
refresh my memory on the clock with regard
The
to the
clock is-
pre-application.
60 days. So let's assume that 60 days starts ticking today, right? So if we look at today as day number 1, we're talking about, let's see, where are we? 20, so 1. We are talking, I think, March, so end of February, beginning of March, right?
For what?
Can I just
For the end of
flag
the 60
something
days.
quickly?
Sorry, go ahead. Go ahead, Maddie.
So the counting of the 60 days, according to our guidelines, doesn't start until the board determines that the application is complete. You just voted to assign Brooke as the designee, but haven't found the application complete yet. So I don't believe that the 60-day
So-
clock starts.
Right. We're assuming that the application can be deemed complete by staff later today.
Okay.
Staff of the board is the board. It
Good.
To
doesn't,
just,
I think we discussed this previously, that the board doesn't have to make a motion to determine an application complete. That our administrative staff, that can be an administrative decision by staff. Kirsten?
Yeah, I think the guideline, if memory serves, also says it's the date of the letter that starts the clock. So this, if we're trying to now count from today, it would be
Might be
contingent on
tomorrow.
getting a letter out today too. And the other thing is
So it might be tomorrow. Yeah, might be
Yeah.
tomorrow.
but
Yeah.
the other thing that factors into Alex's timing question, which I completely agree with, that we were fumbling with a little bit, or with the prior pre-application plan reviews, is be nice to have, at least a week after the site visit and meeting date. But I think the guideline says that the deadline for comments is 30 days from submittal. So
Right.
it's just another, I feel like Brooke can
Right,
kind of
that's-
figure out these things.
Yeah, that's why I was saying we should try to schedule something early in February rather than, February 18th maybe would be the 30 days. Wait, sorry.
Looks like
14th.
March.
February
like-
20th would be the 30 days if tomorrow were the first day. So if we did something, either the first or second week in February, that would give people a week or two for comments after the meeting. Alex?
I was just gonna clarify that. You immediately jumped to the 60 days because the way I asked the question, but I guess what I was getting at was what Kirsten said. It's really 30 days is when we expect comments in. And so, the hearing should be exactly when you indicated, Janet. So this is up to Brooke because you're the designee,
Right.
Brooke. But one of those 2 weeks in early February would be ideal in my mind to accomplish all these aims.
Yeah. And go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to, because we had some difference of preference with our prior regional planning commissions in terms of a site visit. And just wanted to be able to be clear in terms of the board's preference, but that we're not requiring anyone to perform a physical site visit. And I think we all have, you know, various familiarity with the areas and or portions of the area. I know Lamoille County to some degree very well, and other areas that I really am not familiar with. So we leave it up to the regional planners to make a determination how they would like to present their application for this process to us. So we're receptive to site visits. Is that a fair way to characterize it, and find it beneficial? But it's up to our regional planners to choose how to
Would
go
say-
forward.
I would say that, there are board members who would very much appreciate physical site visits. And we don't want to require that regional planning commissions provide for those site visits. If the regional planning commission feels that it's too cumbersome or otherwise does not wish to participate, they don't have to, but we would encourage them to participate with a physical site visit. Other regional planning commissions we've had various, so Rutland provided a bus and,
Sorry.
you know, and others didn't, we didn't even do a physical site visit in Chittenden County. So it runs the gamut, and whatever you, Lamoille County regional planners feel is best for your process and fitting that in is, you know, we'll work with you, basically. So, you know, we did a purely virtual site visit for Chittenden County that the Regional Planning Commission prepared for us. And then in Northwest, we did both. So
Great. So, and I'm sorry to interrupt earlier. So of course, we'd love to have you visit Lamoille County. We're not going to rent you a bus. We're one of the smaller regional planning commissions. So, but we're happy to do both, you know, site visits, but I really like the Chittenden County model, because I feel like if we have maps in front of us and can zoom in on Google Maps and stuff and really show you from a mapping perspective how we came up with some of the boundaries, I think that's helpful beyond just sometimes when you're standing out in the street, it's hard to really see the whole perspective.
yeah. Yes, thanks, Tasha. Sarah?
I was going to say that I think that now that we've designated a board lead on this, that those details can be worked out between the RPC and the board lead, and would just recommend them catching up offline to try and finalize what we're looking at in terms of timelines, type, and what have you.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I agree with Janet, Brooke, to your original question that I think it's up to the RPC as to whether they want to host in-person site visits.
Right.
And you can work that out with them. If they elect not to, and we as a board want to, we will organize our own and we'll take care of that physical site visit on our own. But work with them to see what they would like to do. And if that works for us, then we'll just do that, right?
Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to
Okay.
be sure we were all on that same page after going through
Yeah.
a couple of these. So perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
And sorry, can I ask a question? Do you generally want municipal officials present for those?
I think that's up to, I think here's my point of view. If we're going to show up in a municipality, I think it would be courteous for us to invite municipal officials to that, you know, to give them a particular invitation. So the answer is yes, they don't have to come, but I feel like it's only courteous to invite them. And
Great.
I think we really need to take this offline because we have to get to other things on our agenda. I appreciate Lamoille County Planning Commission being here. And as soon as we're done with this meeting today, maybe I will be in touch with maybe Brooke, if you're available, to talk with Alec about getting those last few pieces. Does that sound good?
Perfect for me.
Thanks.
That sounds great to us. Thank you so much. So, if you're done with us, we'll sign out too. So thank you. We
So-
appreciate
Okay.
it.
Janet, just before we transition, I had something.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I believe that you are working on updating the site visit guidelines. So I think just for everybody to be aware of that, and that hopefully you can share those out once they're sort of revised in a finalized form. And the other thing that I'll just say in terms of the municipal officials, just to have this on the record, is I would agree that it's nice to have the opportunity for municipal officials to come to site visits. However, we did have people that came to the site visits and said things, but then didn't come and actually provide testimony to back those things up. So I think just to be cognizant, and I think this will be reflected in your updated site visit probably guidance, is just reiterating that if people want pieces of information formally for us to consider, they can't just be mentioned at the site visit. They need to be provided either in written or oral testimony. So thank you.
Thank you. Let's see. Next on the agenda is operations, budget, and legislative updates. Pete, do you have anything
Yeah, I
to
can go.
report?
I can go quickly. I know we're at when we were supposed to end for this one, so let me rattle through, and if there's any questions, we can pause. So legislatively, last Tuesday after our meeting, we presented, Janet and Brooke and I, at the Senate Economic Committee, little background on Act 250, and then Brooke talked about the appeals report. Nothing was talked about specific to any pending legislation on any of that, but so that was that testimony. There is going to be some testimony on the wood products manufacturers from others this week in House Ag. There's going to be testimony from us on the extension of Act 248A projects to telecommunication projects, which now have the ability to go through either process. Generally, they tend to choose the PUC process over the Act 250 process. There's a bill H527, I think, that deals with that. And we're just going to give testimony in terms of how our process works and how that would work for telecom projects. At this point, I don't know, I guess this is a point just to pause. If this particular piece of legislation is not something that the board has directed any particular stance on. It was, not flagged earlier on. So at any rate, I just wanted to flag that for you all if you had a particular stance there. Otherwise, I think our approach is to provide the information on how those are processed currently.
And this is extension of a sunset clause, basically, that has happened previously every 3 years.
Yes.
Since the provision that allowed the PUC to look at these applications in the first place, which was it like 9 years ago or more? I can't, Brooke, you would know, right? When did?
Like every 3 years from the original enactment, it's been sunsetting and just has been
Right,
reauthorized.
so it's basically reauthorization of that sunset. And so this is a perennial thing. I feel like we don't have time as a board right now to weigh in on where we want, whether we want that sunset to continue before tomorrow. We're not going to be lobbying one way or the other, as Pete said. We're just reporting on what our process looks like for an application. So, yeah.
Yeah, it looks like they're looking. I listened to all their testimony that they received on this, and it looks like they're trying to figure out a comparison between our public engagement aspect versus theirs, which interestingly came up through the appeals study. And I happen to have practiced in both arenas. If there's any recommendation, I mean, the thing that I think is important to understand is we have this jurisdiction. And the PUC is an option for applicants to go there instead, and typically they do. So, I mean, there isn't that huge, and in fact, we get tower amendment applications now. So that's just important that they understand it's a normal Act 250 process if they come here. So we might be able to provide them some insights from our appeals study. I think that's some factual information we can provide. And maybe also mention the EJ function that we looked at, because that's probably the biggest impediment to having a meaningful participation in that arena. That we have our district commissions, coordinators to be able to fulfill that function. So.
Okay,
So-
go
Yeah,
ahead,
and
Pete.
I can leave it there on the legislative front unless there's other questions. And then just to flag for the board, the interim housing guidance, we're looking at some potential updates to that, make sure it's functioning correctly. And we'll bring those to you all to review at some point, but just wanted to flag that for you all on the operation front. And I don't know if Rachel has specific updates on budget stuff, but overlap with legislative, the governor's address is going on now on the budget.
So do you have anything to report today?
I can give a short update since the last time we met. I think the last thing that I reported on the record in a public meeting is that we were awaiting information from finance and management in the governor's office about a base initiative request that we had related to additional general fund appropriation for the support of 2 positions, limited service positions that were converted to permanent full-time status. That base initiative was denied. And I have the final numbers for our general fund and special fund that went into the governor's recommended budget that's being submitted to the legislature today. So the final tally for our special fund is 1.533 million. The final tally for our general fund is 4.364 million. So just to get that on the record. That's it.
And just to explain to those who may not understand, the base initiative denial doesn't mean that we can't fund those positions. We increased our special fund to fund those positions. And we feel that based on what is coming in, in the first half of the fiscal year, that we're okay to do that. So.
I think we will continue to request through the legislature that initiative be supported, but it's not in the base budget from the governor's office.
Correct. Yeah. Good addition there, Pete. Thank you. Anything else on operations budget legislative? Okay, let's move on to wood products, manufacturing draft statutory recommendation. We got a preview of a memo that Brooke and Kirsten put together. I don't know if you want to share that on screen, one of you two.
I have it up. I'd be glad to.
Okay, go ahead, Kirsten.
Yeah.
And do you want to frame a discussion for the board? Or do you want the board to just jump right in?
We could start with a quick overview and Brooke jump in and By way of background, I think it's actually mentioned in the memo, Brooke and I met with Jenny twice. And subsequently, and we've thought about this long and hard. I think it's largely fairly straightforward, but what you're looking at is excerpts from the wood products manufacturers report that was submitted, a while ago now, 6 months ago, and that consider bringing forward these updates to Act 250 statute to align the exemptions for forestry and logging for consistency with farming, and also to basically reinstate how log and pulp yards were treated for purpose of Act 250 jurisdiction. And so 9 and 10 are right out of the report that was already submitted to the legislature. And this is how the statute reads with respect to farming now. And so, and Brooke, feel free to jump in, or if anyone has questions, but basically if a portion of a tract that's coming under Act 250 jurisdiction by virtue of some development activity, like let's say there's a farm, it's a farm within the Act 250 definition of farming, and someone is seeking an Act 250 permit for a development activity on a portion of that tract, that if the applicant delineates and identifies that there's farming on a portion of the tract, that the Act 250 permit doesn't impose conditions that would negate or conflict with farming or AMPs as adopted by Agency of Ag, Food and Markets. And then it goes on to say that a permit amendment is not required for farming, that may occur, will occur on prime ag soils, and that there is to be a specific affirmative statement that farming is permitted. So this is kind of the existing statutory framework with respect to farming. I don't know if Jenny or Brooke wants to add to that, but it's basically looking to mirror this for purpose of logging and forestry. So, and this is just a mention of how log and pulp concentration yards had been historically considered part of exempt logging and forestry where located below 2,500 feet. And so the recommendation is to remove that from the definition of manufacturing, which would generally be considered commercial. And by way of background, my interpretation of how that came to be part of the definition of wood products manufacturing is because it was listed, I think, for the purpose of extending some of the special provisions and benefits for wood product manufacturers sector. The one-to-one ag soil mitigation ratio, the provisions for a minor process, and operating hours. So Brooke and I have come up with a recommendation for how to address these things. And this is the specific language that we have come up with for consideration. And we are sort of making a parallel with the AMPs adopted by FPR for logging and forestry, in the same way that reference was made on the farming language, references made to the ag AMPs. And importantly, we're denoting that such logging can't, conflict with a permit obligation, nor, preclude the ability of a district commission to provide a permit condition in order to meet the Act 250 criteria. So That's what that second sentence is getting at. Permits issued shall not impose conditions on other portions. That, yeah, yeah, sorry, I hadn't read this right before the meeting. So,
I mean, that's okay, Kirsten. I think that this is totally reflective of where the board was when we submitted that report to the legislature. I feel like this is language that would implement what we recommended, and I believe it's been vetted by our legal team, and I'm ready to just say, looks good, and pass it along to the committees of jurisdiction, noting that this is not for this legislative session, because that would have had to have happened earlier than now. But this basically is the implementation of items 9 and 10 in our report to the legislature.
so,
Alec.
oh, go ahead.
Yeah, agree. Looks good to me. I don't feel the need to debate it any further. I think Forest Parks and Recreation should see it
Yeah, that's what I
before
was just
we
gonna
submit it. And,
Yeah.
but I think they're going to like it because I think it does exactly what they want it to do. And it serves our purpose. So looks good to me. Thank you for drafting.
Brooke.
Yeah, I think, well, if this is what we said to the legislature, that's fine, but I don't think that we need to worry about like, oh, it should have been in before a certain date, or it's not gonna, if the legislators get a recommendation and they choose to append it to something else that they're working on, that's also a possibility. So let's just the facts, ma'am. Let's report to them, and whatever happens with it when it happens, happens, I guess.
Yeah, thanks for that addition.
Yeah,
So, I would like to move on because we're a little bit behind on our agenda. Is there any, Kirsten
Yeah, I
has her
just
hand.
want
Go
to
ahead.
mention that FPR, ANR have been made aware that that the board is looking at this language today, and that it will be provided with an opportunity for input and brought back to the board so that the board can consider what, if there is any input or feedback from ANR, FPR that the board would like to contemplate or would, before this is sort of finalized. So for next steps, I think that we should do that. And then I'll be prepared to bring back any feedback we do receive from FPR, ANR as in a follow-up board meeting.
Yeah,
Sound good?
okay, thank you, yeah.
Okay, I'll stop sharing if that's okay.
Yeah.
And
Okay,
Charlie
are there
Hancock's
any-
here from FPR.
Yeah, I was just going to
Yeah.
ask if there are any comments from anyone on that agenda item before we move along. Charlie?
Hi, all. Good to see you. So I actually hadn't read this memo until about 10 minutes ago. I was tuning in to just kind of hear about Tier 3 in the background. So it's great to hear that there will be another opportunity to come back to the LURB with any feedback from FPR. I think in broad strokes, it aligns with the intent of what we're looking at. I think FPR might still have some nitty-gritty questions around certain aspects of, what exactly, what happens if there's a firewood processor on a 500-acre parcel and one stick of wood from way in the back ends up in that processor? Does that mean the entire property gets looped in under the permit because one piece of wood came off of that land? And how does that work? And so just having a better idea of clarity there, I think it's one area that we'll want to just chat about. But again, having just looked at this language like 5 minutes ago, my mental processes this morning aren't running that fast. So we'll dig into it certainly and then circle back with any comments or questions. But I appreciate the attention to it.
Thank you, Charlie. Any other comments before we move on to the next agenda item on the wood products manufacturers recommendations, related recommendations? Okay. I don't see any or hear any. So next is road construction jurisdiction discussion. Sarah and Kirsten provided a memo to the board on this, and we are looking at some definitional questions at this point. So Sarah or Kirsten, do you want to go ahead and set the frame for the discussion?
I would welcome Sarah if you want to jump in.
Sure, happy to
Like-
tag team. But I'll try and make up a little bit of time on this, and just for the sake of efficiency, say that we provide in the memo the requested clarifications to road and driveway that we discussed, just to sort of frame and refresh for everyone. But I think what we wanted to bring to the board to discuss today are two things. And if we can get through one, great. Two, maybe. And I think the first one that I'll frame up is definitions for improvement and maintenance. And this is particularly critical when it comes to the class 4 roads and how they're treated under the road rule, because routine maintenance is exempted, improvements are not. And so there are a couple different options. We can define what improvements are or what maintenance is, or we can define what both are. But we really need to have a definition for at least one of those, because if we don't, then it's a little bit subject to interpretation. There is a lot of great work that Kirsten did about the definition of maintenance. You can see it's pretty long because there's a lot of history in Act 250 about maintenance that was pulled in. And so the definition of maintenance is considerably longer than the one that we made up of improvements. Kirsten, feel free
I
to
just jump in very quickly to mention that there are a couple elements of this very draft definition of maintenance that do go beyond what is the precedent. So I think this is sort of an aspect of the board thinking about maintenance. Would it be just aligned with the precedent, and obviously the existing provisions in the statute that are specific to class 4 road maintenance? There's already some specificity there. Of course, we don't want to run afoul of that, but I just wanted to flag that, like, there was contemplation that
Kirsten,
perhaps.
do you want to indicate which of those in that list of 7 are going beyond the precedent that you are referring to?
Yeah, I think like full removal of trees to the full width of the right of way could be an instance where it's not fully aligned with some of the precedent, and installation of a bridge, like the precedent gets into a little bit of specificity with respect to replacement of culverts. So it's a little bit nuanced, but and it also depends on how detailed we want to be. Maybe what's in the statute is sufficient, and so
I do have a question about installation of a new or replacement drainage structure. If that's a bridge, that to me seems more than maintenance if it's a new bridge.
So this is, and I will say, so this is the first area that we need to get through. The second area is about conversion of a road or driveway from farming and forestry. So if we have time to get to that, great. So I will sort of frame up too that Kirsten and I had differing opinions on whether we need both definitions or just one. I would say that I advocated for just having the definition for improvements and then let everything else be maintenance, because I'm concerned that sometimes when you have 2 definitions, unless you've incorporated everything in the 2 definitions, you could lose something. And so if you had a definition of improvements, then everything else could be considered maintenance. And so I think the definition for improvement that we have is widening the road and shoulders by more than 4 feet, changing the surface of a road from dirt, because that would sort of help address the, that something was just like partially there, but not fully there. Substantial improvements to the subbasin reconstruction or alteration of alignment. And so I think to Janet's point, if you're putting something substantially there, and I think Kirsten and I talked about like potentially like weight limits, if you do something to increase the weight limit of that traveled way. But I think we backed off from that because then we said, well, what would the weight limit change be? I think we felt that the substantial improvements to the sub base, I think you could classify something structural, a structural change as being sort of incorporated into an improvement versus maintenance.
Hi, Brooke. You have your hand up?
Why are we defining routine maintenance versus improvements pertaining to what and what analysis are triggered to jurisdiction? Class 4 roads?
So specifically class 4. So in class 4, under the road rule, it says basically that routine maintenance and repairs, minor repairs, shall not constitute an improvement. Improvements trigger jurisdiction when they're done to a class 4 road by someone other than the municipality.
Okay, because to my mind, looking at this statute, routine maintenance is defined about the class 4 road situation and gives the shall not includes and the shall includes. And so I don't understand why we would be further defining that. I think we do have quite a bit of Act 250 precedent that would assist in, normal case law that would assist in the interpretation of it. But I just want to be sure that we weren't talking about like trying to define work to an existing road, improving it, or some kind of driveway, whatever it might be. I just want to be sure we're in agreement that the road construction rule applies to building new roads, or this provision about improvement, not maintenance, to class 4 roads, correct? Okay, I just wanted to be sure we weren't further like trying to define, or if you do something to an existing road, because I do not see the road rule as covering or being triggered by improvement to an existing road other than this class 4 situation, right? Okay.
And just quickly before Alex, the class 4 roads are different terms are used in this memo. And I just want us to be consistent. I think it's class 4 town highway that is defined, isn't it? In statute.
Class 4
So
highway.
statute says both class 4 town highway and class 4 highway.
Oh, okay.
So.
Okay, but there is
We'll
a
choose
place
one.
where we say class 4 road here, and I think we should just try to be as consistent as possible. Alex, go ahead.
Okay, a couple things. First, I think I disagree with what Brooke just said, so I just want to make sure we're on the same page. It's clear that the statute refers to new roads and or improvements to class 4 town highways by a person other than the municipality. But is it not the case that this rule should also apply to major improvements to existing private roads?
So can I take a crack at that?
Please do. Trying to get clarity.
So Kirsten and I are working with our legal team on that. There are differing opinions. That's going to be for another day. I think where Kirsten and I are reading it is we are only looking at right now class 4 roads because that's the only area that improvements are mentioned.
Do you have something to add there?
Me?
Yeah, you, sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, you.
Yeah. So I mean, here's the thing. Don't forget, there is normal Act 250 jurisdiction. Okay. So if somebody decides, oh, And I looked into this and looked at a lot of the old cases on when I was trying to understand the conversion from a logging road or farm road into something else. There is this provision about conversion of those kinds of roads. And we do have, I mean, Act 250 jurisdiction can be triggered. A perfect example was the logging road that was turned into access for the tower on Mount Irish at exit 6 off of I-89. Okay. The actual road construction was considered maintenance of an existing logging road, but the new development of another tower being placed up there triggered Act 250 jurisdiction. And so there are other triggers for these, for any kinds of developments, either subdivision, whatever our normal triggers would be. So we have to keep that in mind. And I don't see anything in this statute that gives this jurisdiction over anything but the construction of a road or roads and any associated driveways to provide access to or within a tract of landowner controlled by a person. And then you go into, as used in the subdivision, roads are only two things. They're any new road or any improvement to a class 4 town highway. Town highway and highway is the same thing. So I do
Brooke,
not,
that's where I think I differ with you.
I don't see this as an additional or a different trigger to anything but those two scenarios, because we have normal Act 250 for if you start improving roads, moving them, changing them in any significant way.
So, Brooke, the reason I'm calling this out is A, it's really important. B, there's a nonsensical issue here that I'll raise in a moment, if we interpret it the way that you're implying, which I think is what the statute says, but there's still a nonsensical piece to it. And B, I need a legal interpretation from our team about the provision that's in paragraph Roman numeral 2 that says, as used in this subdivision, roads include any new road or improvement to a class 4 town highway. Include, I need to know whether that is exclusive, whether it means it includes only the following, or if it's broad, meaning it absolutely includes these items and could include others. So that's a legal question that I want our team to sort of rule on. But here's the nonsensical part that makes my mind flip over. There's a provision in the statute that says conversion of farm and forestry roads to development triggers this rule. So how is it possible that someone's private driveway that for all intents and purposes could be far less well-built than a farm or forestry road could be turned into something more and not trigger this provision because it wasn't a new road and it wasn't a class 4 town highway? Or maybe a better example is an existing road that serves 2 dwellings, and there's now going to be a 50-unit subdivision at the end of the road, and the road is going to have to be widened substantially. Like, it just seems nonsensical that a farming road in that situation converted would trigger review, but a road that is less well built for 2 homes wouldn't. But I think you're right, Brooke, that if the legal interpretation is in that paragraph is that includes these 2 things, if it's only those 2 things, there are a lot of people, including myself maybe, that are going to breathe a huge sigh of relief, because it means the jurisdictional import of this rule is way less than I assumed it was going to be. And frankly, what I've been telling people, I thought it was.
So let me tackle a couple of things here, which is I'd like to put aside some of what Alex said for a later date. Kirsten and I are working with our legal team on that. We'd like to have a chance to review that with them as the principals on this project, and put that into a digestible format for another day to bring to the board. I think for the purpose of the discussion today, improvements in maintenance, we're specifically focusing on as it applies to class 4 town highways. So I think in terms of trying to get a read from you is, I think what I've heard so far is there's merit to maybe just defining what improvements are as to defining both. And then I think the other thing that I'll transition to say, because Alex brought it up, it might be a good segue, is the whole definition of conversion. So right now, if you take a look at the road rule, there are three things that can trigger jurisdiction under specifically the road rule. One is when you add length of road or driveway exceeding a certain amount. The second part is when somebody other than municipality makes improvements to a class 4 road. And the third piece is conversion of the road, farm or forestry road. But that also requires, there's more to it. The actual conversion of it doesn't necessarily meet that. It's also, you have to do construction to it. So when it's converted, it just says it no longer gets to exist in sort of an exempt shell. It means that now any work that you do to that could be jurisdictional. And it's sort of, the wording that we've been given is not very well defined. And so I think what we're trying to come up with, you sort of need a definition of what's conversion. At what point does that road no longer become a farm or forestry road? And so I think we tried to give a simple definition that says that it's no longer primarily used for farming or forestry, which does leave it open to interpretation. And I think we at the very least want to have some feedback from the board in terms of, do we allow it to be that open? I think the only other way in terms of providing certainty, and I think this was recommended to us for the sake of enforcement and regulatory purposes, is we say that as soon as it's used for something else. So that as soon as a forestry road is also used for access to a dwelling, it's no longer primarily used for, which is sort of like a very harsh, bright line to establish. But there's also some benefits to it. So I think that's the sort of segue into the second discussion. I'm fine to stick with the first discussion or segue. I know Brooke has her hand raised, but I'll defer back to Janet.
Go ahead, Brooke.
So why are we defining maintenance, repair versus improvements? That would be for the conversion scenario.
No,
Right.
it's
So I
simply
think what-
for class
ahead,
4
Sarah.
road. Sorry.
Okay, all right. I don't
But-
see a need to further define versus what's in the statute, because I think we do have some, case law in this area. The other thing that I would suggest is there's a third alternative. You're talking about defining one versus the other or both. There's also the option of defining none of them, because if we are relying on what's in the statute, I think it's pretty descriptive. So the other thing that I would suggest, though, is maybe to adopt that same language and say it's applicable to, for example, the conversion arena for whether or not a farm road or a forestry road turns into or is primarily used for another reason. I do agree with you. I think there's two prongs to that. It's primarily for a different reason, like, okay, now we're going to develop our subdivision. But also, I think there should be some physical action on the land in the same structure that you're figuring it out for class 4 roads. You're not talking about the repair or maintenance of a road. You're talking about if it's going to be altered in some way and used for a different purpose, is the way that I think is one way to approach this. And I think it's a legitimate interpretation. And the other thing that I just want to mention, because it is in the materials, is the definition of primarily. I'm not so sure I agree with the majority approach. I think it's more along the lines of, look, the only thing that was there, and it was primarily a farm road, now we are using it for a different purpose, because you don't want to get into like, oh, how many people are using it? How many times a day? That kind of thing. In that, like, how many ingredients are being put into that product you're serving? You don't want to get into you want a brighter line, I think, on that definition of primarily. That might be more beneficial for flexibility in terms of what it's being utilized for.
Kirsten.
Yeah, and Brooke, if you have suggestions for how you might otherwise define that, I would be very interested. I just wanted to touch on briefly conversion. So the statute says conversion of a road used for farming or forestry purposes that also meets the requirements of this subdivision. It doesn't explicitly say construction. So we're also kind of noodling on that, and I anticipate that Sarah and I will come back with a more specific, conceptual interpretation for the board to consider. The definition of conversion, that it's just a change in use, I keep going back and forth on, should it say primarily? The statute just says used for farming or forestry. It doesn't say used primarily. And a little bit maybe like Alex, like I keep in my mind thinking about these hypotheticals, and a road used primarily for farming might, for instance, be an existing farm road that also goes out to the farmhouse. And so there's a section of road that one could interpret that's primarily for farming, and it does also serve the farmhouse on the property within the meaning of primarily. But I think the conversion is a little bit narrower and is specific only to farming or forestry roads. It doesn't have the word primarily, so it would be more akin to conceptually a road that goes beyond the farmhouse and out to, the cornfield or whatever other area of the property. So some of this stuff becomes a little bit more complex than we might like, but yeah, I think Sarah and I will return, and as we had a long meeting with Ben last week, we're going to be meeting again this week, and as we continue to decipher how we think this is intended to work.
Sarah?
So I think that you do need to have a definition of improvement, because in our discussion, as Kirsten and I were kicking this around, if an improvement to a class 4 road by somebody other than the municipality triggers jurisdiction, well, is an improvement filling in a pothole? Is it grading the road? I think that's why I felt very strongly that I think we do need a definition for what improvement is, because that's what triggers. I think that there is a lot of great case law and history about maintenance, but I think we perhaps will have a home definition for improvements specifically for class 4 road, because it's going to decide what's jurisdictional. I think the other thing too is the conversion of a road used for farming or forestry purposes that also meets the requirements of the subdivision. Section 12 shall constitute development. Section 12 is that portion that talks to length. So a road triggers jurisdiction when it's converted and also then meets that portion of the subdivision about construction. So I think what Kirsten and I sort of struggled with was what deems a road converted from farming and forestry. And you have many cases, unfortunately, where you have farms that have gone under, and the cows are gone, the farms are left fallow, but there's still that farmhouse, and the farmer still continues to live in the farmhouse. There's no more farming. Is that road now jurisdictional? Has it been converted? And so I think that's why we perhaps do want to have some sort of definitions around that, because I don't think that is what is intended, is that a collapsed farm becomes jurisdictional. I think there needs to be additional development, and I think we should define it a bit more. So I hear all of you, and these are sort of tough questions, because I think we've pointed out the different areas where the wording's subtly different. And I think we have the road rule from 20 plus years ago that we were given this language to sort of improve upon. I think now we're seeing other areas that could be even further improved. But yes, to Kirsten's point, wording suggestions absolutely welcomed. And I think after we get legal, we'll be bringing this back for a third round. Don't know if that will be baked for next week, but So that's just a little bit of the methodology and framing it up. And I think what I'm hearing is more than we can actually get full consideration from the board on today with the time that we have. Thank you.
And I would also just reiterate what, I can't remember which one of us, it wasn't me, but pointed out when we talked about this initially, and that is that the intent of this subdivision is to encourage the design of clustered subdivisions and development that does not fragment areas, tier 2 and tier 3 areas. And so that example that Sarah just gave about a farmhouse, even though, you know, there's no farming there anymore, there's no way that that should trigger just continued use. So I don't know, but just to keep the intent in mind. Somebody reminded of us that when we first started talking about this a few weeks ago, and I think it's a good reminder. Brooke, go ahead.
Yeah, and just to piggyback on what you were saying, keep in mind that in the very beginning, we're talking about roads that are, when you determine jurisdiction, for any new development or subdivision on a parcel that will be provided access by the road that we're talking about. So, and the other thing I just want to mention is, I want to dispel the notion that any work to a road would become, that's jurisdictional. I mean, because that's what the case law has very clearly segmented between maintenance versus improvements to the road. And we have been very liberal in allowing a lot of maintenance, even removal of ledge in the middle of a logging road, and that has not been considered improvements. So we do have our history to protect and to honor in terms of how Act 250 has been interpreted over the years. But so lots and lots of repair and maintenance is done to our existing Act 250 permitted properties without any further kind of amendment or permitting to have to take place.
So a question about the definition of improvement. Number 2 in the definition is changing the surface of a driveway or road from dirt. That the wording kind of stopped me. It's sort of an odd way to word that phrase. But is the intent that if the road or driveway has any amount of gravel on it, then it's not dirt, and therefore changing the surface to more gravel or pavement is not an improvement.
So again, this relates to class 4 town highways. And there are many that are out there that are rather trail status, right? That don't have any sort of a surface on it. And so we try to encapsulate, well, if you were really doing an improvement, what would that look like? And I think Kirsten had the idea about the sub base, substantial improvements. If you're ripping up and replacing, if you're changing the alignment or a new location. And then the other thing was, if it's dirt, that's not really a traveled right of way for vehicular access. It's maybe there as a trail, but the moment that you're paving it or putting gravel down on it, you're substantially improving that. So that was, again, specifically for class 4 roads, and when was the tipping point or what was considered an improvement.
Gotcha. I appreciate.
Can you add by, by applying gravel or pavement?
I think we wanted to leave it sort of open, because then you could wind up with the whole sort of like permeable pavers and concrete and bituminous, and so
Changing the surface. What about just changing the surface of the road?
we'll
Anyway.
continue to work on it.
Yeah, you'll continue to work on it. Go ahead. Brooke.
So hold on, Janet.
Sorry, go
my
ahead.
follow-up question was, I like Brooke's take on the fact that the statute sort of provides the definition for what is routine maintenance and therefore what is not, and what is not is improvements. And I appreciate the work you two have done to sort of widen that out a little bit. But I wonder if this is a guidance document that we're putting together, right? So I wonder if the best guidance we can provide is to clarify what the statute actually says, per Brooke's suggestion, like let the statutory language about what routine maintenance is and what improvements are. And then spend more time in the guidance talking about scenarios, common or relatively common scenarios that a regular landowner or possibly a developer might have, and be like, okay, in this scenario, here's how we would interpret it given the statutory language. I understand you're doing definitions first, and maybe you're going to do those scenarios later in another part of the guidance, but I wonder if we spend too much time, debating how to get the definitions just right, we will have missed something by not having talked about the basic scenarios that are out there for an existing road, for an existing private road, for an existing private driveway, for a class 4 town highway, and the like. Not a question, more of a process comment.
Brooke, your hand was up and then it was down. Do you still have something to add before I call on Kirsten?
No, let's move on. I'd forgotten. I was too interested in what Alex was talking about.
Okay. Kirsten.
Well, yeah, I agree with you, Alex, in that, we're coming up with the ingredients that everyone wanted to see, the bite-sized pieces before it's all thrown into the skillet. But we're kind of needing to have that bigger conversation, I think, is really critical. So at some point, I anticipate that Sarah and I will definitely be returning with a much bigger document with, everything pulled together in a way that hopefully reflects the ongoing conversation. But I think reach out to either one of us too, if there's things that maybe percolate from today or any suggestions.
I think
Okay.
too, where we wanted to try and carve out some exceptions where it made sense under what triggers for improvements is you have unfortunately a whole lot of flood related damage that's occurred over the past several years, particularly. And you could take a look at upsizing a culvert as being an improvement that could then trigger jurisdiction, or trying to rectify some of the ditching and clearing trees to modify and create a shallower ditch line that you don't want to be punitive and trigger Act 250 on. So I hear you in terms of it's tough to create definitions without the scenarios. However, I think we might do best to try and start there. We can absolutely try and have some scenarios, but just I think there are some things particularly that we discussed that sort of led us to the definitions that we've proposed.
I just add that, right sizing culverts because of, erosive issues and whatnot. That doesn't, we're not talking about we're not talking about serving new development that we want to see in terms of clustered subdivisions or whatnot. I mean, I think there are scenarios that just are irrelevant to what this provision, is trying to get at.
I
Right?
understood.
I mean-
However, if you say that improvements to a class 4 road by somebody other than municipality can trigger Act 250, an improvement would be upsizing a culvert.
Is that an improvement? I would say no, it's not, it's right sizing.
So unless you
based
define
on-
it,
Yeah,
unless you
yeah.
define it, if you're
Right.
relying upon case law.
Right, that's what I'm saying. We don't want definitions that result in things like that being improvements, because that is not what this section aims to address. This section, again, aims to address, it aims to encourage the design of clustered subdivisions and development. So, we don't want things to trigger when it doesn't have anything to do with proposed subdivision and development. New development,
Well,
so. We're actually time on this. Brooke had her hand up and that just triggered something in Kirsten's brain too. Is it something we can stick a pin in for you two? Kirsten says yes. Brooke
can
says
stick-
yes.
We
All
can stick a
right.
pin in it.
Okay, thanks. So we have again on the agenda discussion of regional plan pre-application process. I think it's important for us, having done 3 of these, to articulate clear standards that we intend to use as we form these pre-application responses. And I think there are 4 areas in which we should think about this. And we talked a little bit about each of these previously, but I think it's important to be consistent moving forward. So we talked about historic assets and whether there needs to be historic assets in certain of these FLU areas. We talked before about walkability and what walkability might mean in terms of the planned growth in village areas. And I think we talked about that in terms of being something that is context specific. Walkability in Westford is going to be different than walkability in Burlington, which is different than walkability in Manchester. And then flood hazard and river corridor inclusions in the planned growth areas and flood village areas. And lastly, thinking about these as future land use maps. And when there are areas that are proposed for growth, say, that still have rural zoning in place, rural, low density zoning that doesn't allow mixes of uses. You don't have complete streets, you don't have infrastructure, but these are the areas that particular municipality is beginning to plan for growth. And so the board needs to ask for information in those cases, perhaps, that explains that, because we don't have individual municipal plans that we can refer to. We don't have digital data that we can show on a map viewer that tells us what that municipality is planning. We don't have a database that we can look for what the capital plans are for that municipality, that sort of thing. So the question is, if we are asking for additional information sometimes for these areas, as we have, what information are we looking for? I think we need to be as specific as possible for our regional planning commissions when we're asking for additional information. So anyway, that's a preamble. Do others have responses to that or anything to add? No? No comment.
Okay.
So, Kirsten?
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought up the last point about the sort of future land use map sort of aspect of all of this, because my head keeps going there. And I think of this as, I think it's an 8-year plan cycle, right? And so in my mind, I mean, it's not just looking at the present condition, it's contemplating and planning for the growth. And so it's this figuring out in terms of where a region or a municipality is sort of with respect to its capacity and planning and what makes sense in terms of delineating these future land use areas. And I'm not sure we're like, it's difficult sometimes to pinpoint that, I guess is what I'm saying. And we haven't really talked about that as a board that I'm recalling particularly. So, and it goes to things like the walkability. Like in my mind, as a community or an area evolves over time and builds out, then maybe the bus service gets extended a little bit, or there's more multimodal infrastructure, so it becomes more walkable. And what might be walkable like today or in the next couple, foreseeable near future, maybe 10 years out, looks different. So it's hard to, and I'm, I didn't come into this role myself with a strong sort of planning background per se. So I welcome the careful consideration of all of these different elements as we're doing this work. And I think we should be asking the RPCs in terms of the capacity piece. And I think we've done some of this, but we could perhaps do more consistently in terms of the housing targets, explain why that area mapped out sort of aligns with that growth plan. So I don't pretend to have all like this sort of all the, to me, this stuff isn't as black and white as my sort of engineering mind would probably like, but it's the nature of it. And yeah, and I feel like for flood hazard and river corridor, I feel like when I read back through the content and that came through as part of these templates that we came up with, I feel like it's correct. Like it's, but I do want to make sure with the mapping that we have information that that we're, for the areas that don't have flood hazard area mapping, I think we just want to make sure that we're considering that information as a component of the plan review. So anyway, look for, I'm interested to know what others might have to say about these things.
Anyone else? Board members? Sarah?
Do you want to talk about floodplain as an overlay? Too?
Sure. So yeah, we are getting some feedback from some RPCs about rather than mapping flood hazard and river corridors as rural conservation or including them or not including them in the centers and village areas and planned growth areas, et cetera, as rather than that, as identifying them with an overlay on the map. And that sort of that comports with how flood hazard areas and river corridor areas are dealt with on the zoning dimension. They're not excerpted from particular zoning districts. There's an overlay, and the regulations for that overlay control over the underlying zoning district. So this has been posited to us by some of the regional planning commissions. The question is, I guess, I would like legal to weigh in on how we could look at these future land use maps in that way, and whether it accurately or not accurately, but appropriately reflects what's in statute in terms of a description of these future land use areas. Kirsten? Oh, wait, Sarah,
Well,
your
Sarah
hand's
had her
still up.
hand up.
Sorry.
All right, I was just gonna say, I support the idea. I think it makes a lot of sense if we can do it because you have areas that are going through, I think the Lamoille has been subject to an update for several years now that we're not quite sure when it's going to go through. You have areas of approximate floodplain that until you go out do mapping, you have areas that you run into there's a map amendment or map revision. And so I could absolutely see where some sort of an overlay would be best. These are dynamic areas like river corridors too that don't always stay in the exact same location. So I like the idea in concept. I agree with you, Janet, that we need to get legal's read on it, but I think that would be helpful. I think the other thing too is when we talk about in statute, there's the various different mentions of how to quantify floodplain. It's mentioned plain growth areas. It has some of the language, but not all of it that you see in other areas. I think that might be right to have rope into like have legal do a sort of response in totality about all that if possible. Just my thought.
I think we do have a communication from legal on the 3 different paragraphs in statute that that mention whether or not to include flood hazard and river corridor in planned growth areas, in village areas, and in tier 1B areas. And we can revisit that, but let's go to Kirsten.
So Janet, just specifically meant with regard to overlay too.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Oh, okay. I thought you meant both. Okay. Okay. But anyway, revisit that communication from our legal team. And yeah, let's ask our legal team for some interpretation on the other, on the overlay idea. Kirsten.
Yeah, so my recollection of the memo addressing this topic is specific to village area, but if we do have one that's more expansive and that encompasses plant growth area, then I will look for that. I'm open to this concept, but I would need to think about it and hear from legal. And I also, as Sarah mentioned, I mean, it's the nature of these that they do change, and especially with areas doing updated FEMA mapping, it kind of, it's tough to capture with this sort of fixed plan review. And then something is dynamic and changes, and how are we dealing with that? Sorry.
Do you need a drink of water?
I'll be right back, but carry on.
Okay. Okay. Alex?
Seems like from the VAPTA methodology that this is already addressed. I'm looking at the VAPTA methodology now, and on page 5, right before downtown centers, the first future land use area that's indicated, the first section is floodplains and river corridors, and it indicates that the mapping should show them as an overlay with crosshatching. And it goes on to say that that these areas will be included in the underlying future land use area that the RPC deems most appropriate for the location. And when I jump to rural conservation, at least in the statutory language, there doesn't appear to be any mention of flood hazard areas and river corridors. So it's not clear to me that they need to be defaulting to rural conservation. I don't think they do. And maybe it's as simple as pointing RPCs back to their own VAPTA guidance that says they don't. They just need to be whatever the underlying, most appropriate land use area is, and still shown with that crosshatching on the maps.
Yeah. Though there is still this question, Alex, of the 3 paragraphs that do refer to including or not including flood hazard and river corridor areas and planned growth areas and village areas and in tier 1B areas. So
the statute is pretty clear that it wants to make sure they are not included in those areas, which are growth areas, unless they meet certain requirements, right? Unless there are certain conditions
Unless
present.
unless it's infill,
Right.
yeah.
Or there's
and
regulations in place that govern
not
blah,
or,
blah,
but
blah.
and regulations,
Right.
except for village areas, which it doesn't matter whether you have regulations, you can have infill. So, yeah.
Right. So my point is, like, in those areas, there's a specific test. And legal gave us an interpretation, their interpretation of that test, because I think Kirsten had one interpretation and some of us had a different, and then legal gave us theirs. I don't know if we need to talk about that specifically, but everywhere else, it seems like flood hazard areas can be mapped as transition infill, as rural general, as rural ag forest, as enterprise. They can be mapped as anything. They don't have to be rural conservation.
Yeah. Kirsten, are you back with us?
Yeah, I'm here.
Did you have anything to add? Or were you done?
Oh, no, I was done when I started
Okay.
calling.
Okay,
Thank
so
you.
we are, this is a discussion that we're going to continue. I would like to, in the next two meetings, sort of articulate clearly where we are on each of those 4 points. And Alex, that was very helpful to refer back to the VAPTA methodology, and maybe it's not as much of an issue as we are, as everybody had been thinking it was. So that's good. So let's move on to tier 3 rulemaking discussion, unless there is any comment from anybody else in attendance on the regional plan pre-application process before we go to tier 3. Okay, I guess there is not. Let's move on to tier 3 rulemaking. Alex, take it away.
So the revisions to draft 2.1 that was released in October are still underway. I don't have a document, a set of red line changes to show you yet. Rebecca and I are collaborating to have that ready, hopefully later this week, so that it can be reviewed at next week's meeting. We'll see. So today I wanted to do just some discussion on some ideas that are percolating and that I've been drafting revisions about. And so I'm just going to walk you through a few of them and explain sort of the issue and then where I'm going with it, to just get your input while we're still in the drafting mode. One more reminder though, several weeks ago, I sent you a message saying, hey, we've received a lot of public input to date. We'll get more, but it's time for all of you to actually start making your way through all of that. And as I indicated in that email, each of you attended one of the public engagement sessions in late October. So you heard firsthand a lot of feedback, but we've received a lot more in writing through email, and I haven't put that all in front of you until a few weeks ago when I said, here's where it is, go look at it. So if you haven't had a chance to make your way through all of that, please do. It's hard to do in one reading because it's a lot, but please make your way through that, because all of those comments factor into the changes that Rebecca and I are working on, whether they were comments from the Agency of Natural Resources or a comment from a landowner in Grafton. So just another encouragement to take a look at that. So the first item that I'm been revising the draft on has to do with jurisdiction in tier 3 areas related to subdivision. And to refresh your memory, in the last draft, we talked about it at length, and the board felt like we do not want subdivisions within a tier 3 area to trigger jurisdiction automatically. We want that jurisdiction to be triggered by actual development, actual impacts to the tier 3 area, not just that there happens to be some tier 3 in the corner of your 100-acre parcel and you're doing a subdivision to divide it in 3 pieces to give to your kids or something like that. But we introduced this, what I think is a problematic provision that says, well, it's not jurisdictional, but we do want you to get a JO, a jurisdictional opinion, if the property you're subdividing has any tier 3 area. And we want that jurisdictional opinion to recognize that there's tier 3 mapping on the property, indicate which of the lots that are being created will have the tier 3 mapping, and that potentially any development in the future in those tier 3 areas might require an Act 250 permit, and let's have that JO recorded in the land records as sort of a buyer beware provision to anyone purchasing these newly created lots. I think that's a problematic process. I don't think that's really one that we were necessarily aiming for. As I was discussing it with other folks, there was an attorney who brought up the point, hey, if you're concerned about people being aware that there's tier 3 area on a property, then why do you
noteworthy in it,
why do you not care about properties that are just being transferred?
Hold on a minute,
without any
Alex.
subdivision.
Sorry.
It's okay. I muted Billy, so we're good.
Okay, but can you repeat what you just said?
Yeah. So what I'm saying is the attorney said, listen, you appear to be concerned if a property is being subdivided and those lots transferred to some new owner if they have tier 3 on them, and you want some sort of buyer beware provision in the land records. But what about all the other properties that are transferring every week, every month in Vermont that have tier 3 areas and are not getting any sort of buyer beware jurisdictional opinion, kind of information? And I looked at it and I said, that's a really good point. Most properties that transfer are going to transfer that way, not as a result of a subdivision. So in any case, that's sort of the philosophical issue that I see with that. And I have sort of 3 alternatives that I've been thinking of. One is to just take a step back and say, actually, if we don't want there to be jurisdiction, then maybe there shouldn't be any, and there's no need for a JO, and we have tier 3 mapping, and everybody in the state will have access to it. It'll be public, and they can do it themselves. They can figure out for themselves whether the lot they're buying might have tier 3 areas on it through that publicly available information. Realtors will probably help them. Title search attorneys might, all that sort of thing. So that's option 1. Let's just keep it simple. That's the simplest option. I think another option would be to get away from the issuance of a JO, get our coordinators out of that awkward sort of situation, and instead, require just anytime there's a subdivision that a general sort of provision be recorded in the deeds for those properties. And you see this sometimes with wastewater permitting, where somebody comes in and does a subdivision, they don't want to get a state wastewater permit because they haven't done any design, and so there's a deferral permit sort of notice that goes into their deeds that says, this property, is subdivided without a wastewater permit, any future development may require one, that sort of thing. So that's sort of option 2. It's kind of what we were proposing in draft 2.1, but without the involvement of our coordinators in the issuance of a formal JO. And then the final option, and maybe there's more than 3, the final option would just be, okay, let's just establish jurisdiction, period. And go through that process, and issue a permit, or something akin to that, which seems like we didn't want to go that way in the first place, but it's still sort of an option out there. Any initial thoughts on, way I framed it, like whether you think the philosophical issue is an issue, and if so, which of these options is most attractive to you?
I think I agree that it is an issue. We shouldn't be requiring JOs. I think that is awkward. In retrospect, Alex, I agree. And the question is how to get the word out. And I think that's sort of part of our as a program, our general outreach to the public, that we know that we need to improve and do more of overall. So, maybe I think that though requiring requiring something be recorded in the deed, like for water, wastewater, is something that would require, wouldn't it require more than just rulemaking?
It might, it's a
Yeah.
good point.
So I think in the interim, it's a PR problem that we need to address, and we need to figure out how to get this information out there, that people need to be aware that you could, you could have tier 3 on your property. And it's a general problem across the state, not just for new subdivisions. So getting information out to title searchers, getting information out to realtors, and getting information out generally is important. But let's hear from other board members. Brooke.
Whenever we start talking about notice and land records and Act 250 jurisdiction attaching to property, I'm cognizant of the concerns by title searchers and lawyers who do real estate transactions, and it might benefit us to reach out to like Will Michael, who's general counsel of one of the Vermont title insurance companies. He's always been very helpful to the bar. If lawyers had questions about certain things, to reach out to him, and he's very, very useful and helpful with his time. So if we're doing anything like that, that's outside the norm of like a JO kind of process, I would love for us to reach out to get some input.
Thank you, Brooke. Sarah?
So I hear what Alex is saying. I understand the want to do belt and suspenders in terms of making sure that if there's a subdivision and we know that there's tier 3 of doing a jurisdictional opinion or something like that, to record it. However, I think to Jan's point, there are many properties out there that might not be subject to subdivision that are also going to be subject to tier 3. So I don't think that you need to go through the exercise of asking title opinions or JOs. I think it's just one of those, it would be nice, but it sounds like it will actually make things more complicated. So in the absence of that, why not just treat subdivided properties the same way that you would existing properties, and it's the actual development that triggers some sort of jurisdictional opinion or jurisdiction, and leave it at that.
Just keeping in mind that our statute defines subdivision as a type of development. So if somebody might think that is actual development, I mean, you could interpret it that way because it meets the definition of development under Title 10. So, Kirsten, any thoughts?
Yeah, no, I understand the conundrum, and I'm familiar with the whole history of, deferral permits that were issued when one obtained a subdivision permit, and then those were replaced with deed language. And I certainly recognize it's not it's not the same for the array of other properties that might also have tier 3. And so I can understand why. Yeah. And I think PR is always going to be helpful. And so it's the kind of thing we would encourage people to come and seek verification of whether or not they need a permit. And so I'm fine. I'm interpreting, the board wants to not require a JO. And I also, recognize that is adding process and administrative work, et cetera, that there's that element too. So I'm okay with moving away from that earlier concept.
Okay.
Great. You'll see language, so it's not the last time to talk about it. I'm going to jump to another item that was on my list, and I see that Charlie Hancock is still here, so I'd kind of like to jump to one that I know is near and dear to his heart, and that has to do with trail construction. I think one of the one of the very common pieces of feedback that we received at those public engagement sessions, and also via email, was from trail groups that were really concerned that draft 2.1 said that any new trails constructed over 100 feet within a tier 3 area would trigger the need for an Act 250 permit. And there was real concern that that was overreach, and that more importantly, it would stymie the creation of new trails within Vermont, especially on private lands where a landowner is being asked to provide access or maybe an easement. And that landowner's level of concern goes way up when they're told, well, not only are we asking for that, but you got to co-sign on an Act 250 application for this new trail that you're doing a good thing for all Vermonters to host on your property. So it was pretty clear to me, early on that very conservative jurisdictional trigger that we created for trails wasn't really workable, but it was a place to start the conversation. And it is true that not all trails are created equal. In the email I sent you, I encourage you to check out Title 10, Chapter 20 of state statute that talks about the Vermont Trail System, as well as the Vermont Trails and Greenways Council website. And ANR's Vermont Trail System website. Those resources are really important to understand that the state has essentially created a registration system for trails that pass a certain muster as determined by the Agency of Natural Resources. And those trails become, once they're recognized by the Agency of Natural Resources, they become part of the Vermont Trail System. And these are trails that have public benefits. And if you look on those websites that I indicated, you'll see the groups that have trails that are within that system. These are groups that we all know very well across the state of Vermont, right? The Green Mountain Club, the Catamount Trail Association, the Nature Conservancy, the Vermont Association of Snow Travelers. So these are not your backyard homeowners association, trail network. These are very well-established trail groups that know what they're doing and are building and maintaining trails that benefit all of Vermonters because of the access they provide more widely. So with that as sort of a premise, I think that the easiest option here is to recognize that those trails are already vetted and that we don't need to establish jurisdiction when new trails that are going to be within that system are being created, just to give them a complete exemption for new trails, even if they pass through a tier 3 area. The other option is to parrot our existing Rule 71 in our general rules, which does create a 2-tiered level of jurisdiction for trail construction, once again, based on whether the trail is part of the Vermont Trail System. And what it basically does is it applies our commercial trigger of parcel size to that question. And it says if you're creating a new trail that's part of the Vermont Trail System, then we're going to use the 10-acre town criteria, and your impact has to be, for public projects. So your impact has to be 10 acres. And from a trail standpoint, that's a lot of trail. It takes you like 10 miles of trail to finally trip the need for an Act 250 permit under the current Rule 71 jurisdiction. Or if you're not in the Vermont Trail System, then you're in that 1-acre parcel size provision. It's actually a little more complicated than that in Rule 71, which is why I get turned around with it all the time. But to sort of make it easier for you to understand, I think the easiest option is to recognize the Vermont Trail System trails are already well managed and are part of a registration system with the Agency of Natural Resources, and to just exempt those new trails, and to deal with all other trails with a larger trigger within a tier 3 area, so that it's not 100 feet, perhaps it could be 1,000 feet, so that there would still be jurisdiction if impacts were substantial, the impact area, but not capturing, every minor addition or relocation of a trail. So sorry, that was long-winded, but thoughts on trail exemptions and whether or not what your appetite is for increasing them?
I agree with you, Alex. Recognize those that are part of the Vermont Trail System as already vetted. Sarah?
Agreed as well. I'll leave it at that.
Kirsten and Brooke?
This is an issue that goes back to me being a baby lawyer, because I was the lawyer for Bass that argued that the Vermont Trail System should be exempt from Act 250, or at most should be just the trail corridor once it reached 10 acres in jurisdiction. So it's an issue close to my heart because I worked on it for a long time.
But if you were a baby lawyer, you were working on behalf of your client, what do you think as a board member of the LURB?
So what's important from my recollection of our arguments back then on behalf of VAST was that there was an organization that was accountable and that was supervising the local clubs and their construction of the trail system. And at that time, it was only the VAST trail system, which has over the decades exponentially increased. But as Alex pointed out, it's very well-known, sophisticated groups. So I'm perfectly fine with that. But that was the basis for the argument because there was proper supervision. Yeah. And the other thing in that arena, it was about, at that point in time, it was about winter trails. It didn't have the same impact of use during the summer, and that's all changed. So I think that our existing jurisdiction over trails is perfectly fine. My only question is, if we're plowing through a Tier 3 area, what about that? Are we?
That is the question. That's what we're talking about. Sorry, I didn't frame it as clearly as I should have. Yes, our existing Rule 71 deals with trail construction everywhere. And you have to hit a certain number of miles of trail to then trigger jurisdiction, regardless of where it goes. And what we're talking about is just within Tier 3 areas, should the jurisdictional trigger be different? So we could have it be exactly the same as Rule 71. That's one option, and that's actually what I think Charlie, who's on the call here, was suggesting in feedback from Forest Parks and Recreation. And I kind of took it the next step further and said, well, wait a minute, like Vermont Trail System trails are reviewed and recognized by ANR and overseen by groups that know what they're doing far better than we do. And why not just make them wholly exempt, which is a step beyond Rule 71, but would apply to Tier 3 areas. Yeah.
Kirsten.
So just as a point of clarification, Rule 71 in of itself doesn't define in its entirety whether or not Act 250 jurisdiction applies. You have to look at, the definitions of development, involved land, et cetera. But I think you gain an understanding, Alex, of how that works and sort of in the practical sense. My thought would be if the board does want to just maintain the status quo with respect to trails, including in Tier 3 areas, then don't make it something different or slightly more relaxed, because it's the nature of trails and their linear features that they tend to cross sometimes multiple properties, or they're going to go in and out of the Tier 3 potentially. And I think it's creating unnecessary and added complexity if you have, talk about head scratching. I mean, it's already kind of tricky to sort out if jurisdiction applies and adding up the length of trail, et cetera. And so, to me, you wouldn't want to have one standard inside the tier 3 and another outside, if you're talking about an individual trail project, I just think that's going to be sort of a quagmire. Yeah, I'm interested to see where the conversation takes us in terms of the topic as a whole. I think that, yeah, there's sort of a spectrum of trails, and some of them can be more impactful, and some of these resources can have sensitivity, and so it, you know, but you know, if ANR is coming in with a recommendation, you know, I know Charlie and Billy are with us, maybe they would add to conversation.
I think I agree, Kirsten. I don't think that we should go beyond Rule 71 for tier 3 only. It doesn't make sense. I think if we want that broader exemption for trails, that's a different question for a different time. So have we heard from all of us on this one? I think on this question, Alex, I think we have. Sarah, you put some thoughts in too, right? Okay.
I can go on to the next one when you're ready.
Yeah, let's do that. Oh, Kirsten, did you raise your hand again? You're muted.
Oh, sorry. Just very quickly, while we're still on trails, I'm recalling, I think Pete had made known that there's like a working group that's been meeting and maybe will be reaching some kind of status of making a recommendation with how, you know, trails should or shouldn't be regulated in Vermont. And so it'll be, you know, I think that when that information becomes available, I don't know what the current status is, but that would be important to consider. I think Pete's here. I don't know if he has any update.
I agree, Kirsten, and I do think both of you are sage. You know, I'm trying to balance a lot of input from a lot of different groups. Several of those trail groups, their input was, please exempt us entirely. Like, do you not understand what we do and the expertise we have? They weren't saying that in a you know, mean way, but you know, just sort of an educational way. But I agree. I think that if we're going to have a larger question about broader exemptions for trail construction, it probably deserves to happen as a part of our broader rule update that we will get to later this year, which will include Rule 71 perhaps. And by then, Kirsten, the effort you're talking about hopefully will have borne some fruit and help inform that.
Right.
Well, yeah, but just so there's no misunderstanding too, the practical effect of the current framework with respect to trails is that, like, from my observation and experience, that the vast majority of trails that are part of the Vermont trail system are exempt. Like, they don't end up going through Act 250 permitting because, particularly when they're considered on an individual project basis, they don't reach that larger length threshold that you mentioned, Alex.
And I think that's the solace that we can provide to the trail groups that are working at the statewide level and have trails that extend, you know, for hundreds of miles. And that solace is exactly what you said, that, you know, on a project by project basis, typically you're not going to you don't trigger jurisdiction anyways under Rule 71. Okay, well, we can talk more about that when we see the revised language, and then maybe again, like I said, when we do our general rules. The next item that I've been working on has to do with our general exemption, and I think this is the one that most, like, average Vermonters that I talked to had a really negative reaction to, and that was we indicate that within a Tier 3 area, you get a certain envelope around an existing structure within which any construction would be exempt from Tier 3 jurisdiction, right? We'll talk about that in a moment if we have time, the size of that. But then we go on to say, if you want to do construction outside of that envelope around an existing structure, you can do up to a 200 square foot structure, including any sort of associated land that goes along with that structure. And I can't tell you how many Vermonters I talked to who said, do you not understand how rural life works? You have a house, you have a garage. a few years later, you build that pole barn to put your tractor in, and you put a shed roof off of one side for your wood storage. Then you make another improvement for the maple sugaring equipment that is, someday going to happen, but is not part of your operation today. Anyways, I had people explain to me like how it worked for them over the span of 5 years purchasing a 40-acre property, and how the bubble that we identified around the existing structure is not sufficient to address the overall sort of development that is common, typical for rural properties. I had other folks comment on if it's a property that's going to be newly developed, shouldn't there be some like minimum allowance for someone to build a home and an outbuilding just for a single unit dwelling without having to go through Act 250? And I would explain that Tier 3 is a different concept. It's not based on the size of the development. It's based on the location and its impacts on critical natural resources. And people generally understood that, but still shook their head and said, it doesn't make sense. You're applying a very comprehensive review process to a very small development that even in a Tier 3 area is going to have a very small impact. So we talked about this already, but what I want to get your feedback on is, can we tease apart the 3 Tier 3 resource areas that are part of the mapping right now? I think that within a significant natural community that's very rare, it makes sense to be very conservative. And I think the 200 square foot sort of exemption allowance is probably enough. To do more than that could potentially eliminate one of those communities or a big chunk of it. I think within the headwater stream areas where there are very steep slopes, the introduction of a road that slabs across that area with a fairly small square footage impact could have a very outsized impact on stormwater runoff or erosion because of the nature of those slopes. So I think a 200 square foot, very conservative limit makes sense there as well. But within the habitat connector areas, I don't think it makes sense. I think we should have a much larger general exemption area for new development or for development outside of the sort of bubble around existing structures, because these habitat connector areas are going to be large in the places where they exist. They're not going to be small, tiny footprints, and they're going to be based on roads and proximity to roads. And the ability for someone to develop, let's say, a half an acre within their 12-acre parcel that's near the road and happens to be mapped in a habitat connector area, you can do that half an acre development without compromising the overall connectivity of the landscape, because a half an acre, for example, is just a very small amount of land. It's a lot more than 200 square feet, but it's very, it's small in relation to the habitat connectors we're mapping. Remember, my last conversation with you for clarification was, do we really need to go to 2,000 feet away from the road for the habitat connectors? And the response was, yeah, you kind of do, the way the road rule is being interpreted. So again, pretty large areas where they exist. I think that a larger general exemption would make sense and would very much help address the comments that we're getting from the realtors community, from average Vermonters, and from other folks. Thoughts?
I tend to agree with you in terms of differentiating the 3 critical natural resource areas, Alex. These natural communities are fairly constrained usually, right? And the headwater stream areas, those are areas that aren't very developable anyway, and would probably be avoided by anybody that was, looking to develop their property, right? If they had, a rural 40-acre property, what are the chances that the best place to put their sugar house is in one of those areas, right? So
Yes, access is the only time that's likely to be developed. You're right. Not going to put your house on a 35% slope, but you might need to put your driveway across it.
Right, so I agree with you there. I think I need to think a little bit more about the habitat connectors and see where we're landing in terms of the final mapping on that. How much of that are, you're still trying to pare it down. So those are my initial thoughts. Brooke?
How did we come up with the 200 square foot number? Because as I step back from that and I go, that's like less than 15 feet by 15 feet or 10 by 20.
Yeah,
It's
the genesis
such
of
a
it was the genesis.
minuscule. Yeah.
It is. Yeah. The genesis was this. In the first draft, which the public never saw, but you all did, I proposed that we determine jurisdiction based on a certain square footage of impact within a tier 3 area. And my suggestion was, let's set it at a third of an acre, 15,000 or so square feet. And if you're disturbing that much tier 3 or more, then you need an Act 250 permit. And if you're under that, then you don't need a permit. And when we had that conversation, I think most of you were thinking that's potentially a lot of impact on a tier 3 area. Like, think about a significant natural community that's only 20,000 square feet in size, and you could potentially impact almost all of it. And so your input, the way I read it was, your input was do jurisdiction differently. Don't base it on a certain critical number of impact area. And so we did that. And then I came back to you and I said, but wouldn't it be preposterous if somebody wanted to build a simple 10 by 15 shed? And we said that footprint in a tier 3 area requires a full Act 250 permit. And you were all a little bit like, well, maybe it should. But then I think you sort of gave in to me and said, yeah, okay, for like the small structures, we're going to let those go. That's where the 200 square feet came in, was the ability to say, I can build a decent sized shed and not end up having to get an Act 250 permit just because I happen to be in a habitat connector or any other tier 3 area. But now I'm saying, I think the public is telling us that's not enough. Like that's going to force too many regular Vermonters who are doing inconsequential development and having very small impacts on tier 3 areas into an Act 250 process that is not designed for them.
Yeah, I recall saying that very early on, that, that amount could really destroy a particular critical natural resource area, right? But it was also before we had a good understanding of what is being proposed for the tier 3 critical natural resource areas. And like I said, I think I agree with you on the natural communities and the headwater stream areas is separate from the
Habitat connectors.
Habitat connectors. And I think for now, I just like to see what the final map looks like on the habitat connectors before making a final sort of nation as to what should be jurisdictional.
Anybody else have a gut reaction to this possible expansion of the general exemption area within habitat connector areas?
Kirsten?
Yeah, I feel similarly in the sense that I think it can make a lot of sense if it's not too complex with the mapping to have jurisdiction reflect the particular resource. And so, like Janet, I also would like to look at the mapping, and I'm a little thinking about how with the habitat connectors, it can depend on where the development activity occurs within the connector, maybe, or I don't know if there's a way to consider that as part of defining sort of the framework here. But at the end of the day, I do want to have really like maps that are clear, published, that everyone can look at, and then clearly defined triggers. So if there's a map that's all tier 3 and it's different colors and people can look at it and say, you know, if you're in the blue zone, here's how it works. If you're in the red zone, here's how it works. Like, that's fine if it makes sense for the resource. So, but I would like to see the maps for the habitat connectors and just understand a little bit better where we are with that as a whole before saying, okay, let's go in this direction. Or that
Sarah.
particular resource.
Sarah, go ahead.
I agree that makes sense for right now. I'll spare you I'll give you sort of the thought that I had of you could have like tier 3 A, B, and C. And depending on, but then you might have chances where you have a little bit of everything. So I think that's the area that this all makes sense very preliminarily, but I hear Janet and Kirsten saying it, you want to see it mapped, but I want to see what it looks like when you maybe have a little bit of everything all together. And I'd envision that there would be language that the stricter would prevail. But just food for thought.
Seems make
as we move
sense.
forward. Thanks.
Yeah. Thanks, Sarah.
Brooke, go ahead.
Yeah, and Alex, I do appreciate sort of the moving target on this because it's now we're looking at it sort of from a different perspective. I just want to throw out this idea because I think it is very important to our Vermont tradition, and that is the idea of curtilage. Curtilage is a terminology used to describe the area around a home that's the frequent area of human habitation, and it's sort of the bubble that we envision for our privacy. And it's not necessarily historically defined with specificity about like this is how many feet or inches, but it's the idea that the area around your home is your private area. And that I think is an important idea when I hear the concerns expressed by landowners. Wait a minute, this, what about I want to build my garage and I'm trying to save money to be able to do that in 10 years or 5 years, and being able to develop those single family or whatever abode configuration that you have. I think that's important and we should keep that in mind. So I was originally very strict in my thoughts about any kind of exemptions, but yeah, this is not an easy, challenging task. That's all I'm going to say. It's very, very challenging.
Yeah, and Brooke, the curtilage, thank you for my new vocab word for the day. I didn't know that word. But that there's a scientific sort of basis for that outside of your own privacy that's built into the Vermont conservation design data that we are trying to use as Vermont's sort of best science on this sort of topic. And that speaks to another issue, which I'm not going to go into because we don't have time, but the area around a house that within Vermont conservation design is assumed to have enough impacts that it's not mapped as a habitat block for any purpose. It's not mapped as interior forest or connectivity habitat. It's just not mapped as a habitat block, is about 2 acres. Now it's circular the way they do the mapping because it was just easier to do it that way, and it sort of makes more sense from a scientific standpoint. But it is about 2 acres, and so we'll talk more about that at our next meeting on trying to right size the rules to reflect both your concept of curtilage and the VCD data and the way it's mapped.
Which I'll just mention is consistent with our homestead exemption notion in
2
Texas.
acres on the current use. Isn't though, Alex, are those the circles that we see on the habitat connector mapping? Are those really 2 acre circles?
Yeah, they're much larger than draft 2.1 of the rules, would have indicated. We indicated a 50-foot swing around a house, and it's really in the VCD mapping like a 60-meter swing around the building footprint. So yeah, it's about 2 acres.
That's a good good thought. Maybe you can take that as a jumping point.
Yep.
Fertilage. How do you spell that, Brooke?
CURTIL. I don't know.
Okay, but it's a T, not a D. Okay, it's not curdling.
Right.
Oh, thanks for the edification. Vocabulary edification. Okay, we are time on this topic. Alex, do you feel that you got the information you need to keep moving?
So that was super helpful, and we'll talk more next week.
Okay. Any comments from anyone present on tier 3 rulemaking at this point before we move on to our next agenda item? Seeing and hearing none, let's move on to our next agenda item, discussion of appeals, enforcement, and attorney-client communication, a proposed executive session. Brooke?
The board needs to discuss pending and probable Act 250 appeals and enforcement actions and to have confidential attorney-client communications on these matters. Therefore, I move that we find that premature public knowledge of these matters would place the board at a substantial disadvantage and the board enter executive session.
Thank you. Sarah?
I'll second.
Thank you. Any discussion? Okay, let's vote on that. All those in favor, say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
That is 5. So we will enter executive session and return to this meeting upon conclusion of our executive session before adjourning. Thank you, everybody. All right, we are returned from our executive session. We have a few motions to make and vote on. We are still recording, so we're ready to go here. Sarah, you had a motion?
Yep, I would like to make a motion to convert enforcement cases number 2022-043 and enforcement case 2024-010 from assurance of discontinuance to administrative orders.
Second.
Thank you, Alex. Any discussion? Seeing and hearing none, all those in favor, please say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
That is unanimous. Brooke, I believe you have a motion.
I move to authorize enforcement to send a final citation to the respondent landowner in enforcement case 2025_073.
Okay. Do we have a second?
I'll second.
Thank you, Kirsten. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Okay, thank you.
And I have a
Kirsten?
motion as well.
Yeah, go ahead.
I have a motion in enforcement case 2025-075. I move to authorize enforcement to transmit a notice of alleged violation with a directive to file the required land use permit application within 90 days in this case.
I'll
Okay.
second.
Thank you, Brooke. All those in favor of this one, please say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
That is also unanimous. Thank you. I think that was all of our motions.
Agreed. I'll
Yes.
move to adjourn.
Okay, thank you,
Second.
Alex. Thank you, Brooke. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
That is unanimous. So thank you, everybody. See you next time.
Thanks.